Local Control Funding Formula and Early Learning Programs, a webinar presented by Children Now.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is Jelena with Children Now. Just a few logistical things. The webinar is being recorded, so we will send that out as soon as it's up and live on our site after the webinar. Also, you can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but if a question comes to you during the webinar, feel free to submit it, and we'll answer those at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to Children Now's president, Ted Lumpert.
Well, thanks, Jelena, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to be doing this webinar today on the local control funding formula and early learning programs. So first off, we've got a great group of folks on this webinar today, a diverse group of folks in many ways, including a knowledge level about local control funding formula. So, there's some folks on the phone who know all the ins and outs of the new law and are following very closely or part of the regulatory process at the state board. There's other folks on the phone today who are, what's LCFF, what's an LCAP, and really are new to this issue. So we're going to try to present this in a way that works for folks who have a lot of knowledge, but also those who are pretty new to this issue. The other key, framing issue I want to answer is, why are we talking about early learning in relationship to LCFF? Well, I think all of us who are early learning advocates on the phone know that the answer to that question, anyone that's had a kid in the last 20 or so years or looked at the research or really focused on what it takes to make sure you're going to have a sound education these days, know that learning does not begin in kindergarten but begins at birth, and that if we were going to start over with our systems, we would really make sure that we had access to high quality early learning and development opportunities for all children starting at birth. And instead, what we have is folks who have the resources are accessing those high quality programs early on in their children's lives, and too many children in this state don't have access to those programs. So what we have is essentially a wide gap but by the time kids are starting kindergarten. So it's really critical for any education policy issue that we're addressing to be making the connections with early learning and birth to 5. Now, the bad news with local control funding formula is this is a really tremendous law that focuses on equity and local flexibility, but it did not focus on really expanding resources for California education. So it's not that there are suddenly a lot of new resources overall that we can use for the birth to 5 system, which is in very much need of a major infusion of dollars. The good news, however, is LCFF does make sure that additional dollars are getting to kids in need, high concentration of poverty, foster care kids, English language learners, and in many cases districts can use those dollars for early learning and really trying to make sure that those students have the support they need. And as we'll get into later in this webinar, there's also an opportunity for all districts through their community planning processes to highlight the importance of early learning as it relates to educational achievement. So with that overview, I also want to let folks know that in Los Angeles, thanks to First 5 LA, the effort to really educate K-12 district leaders about early learning has already begun. We're working very closely with First 5 and a range of partners in Los Angeles, Advancement Project, LA Early Edge, and Chamber of Commerce, and others to really work with all the school districts in Los Angeles to educate them about the need for early learning and to work specifically with each of the districts there. So we've still got a lot of work to do in LA, but also to take that process that we're using in Los Angeles County to work with counties throughout the state and working with First 5s and other learning advocates throughout the state. So this is just the beginning. This webinar is to try to get folks on the same page as to where things stand with the potential for early learning in LCFF. But we will be providing, going forward, some toolkits and talking points and resources to folks throughout the state and really providing them support in ways to talk to their school districts about incorporating early learning either in the short term in terms of getting additional dollars beyond what some districts are already providing in the early learning space, and then as noted for all districts, how they can incorporate early learning into their planning process. So with that, I've got to turn it over, but also want to just note that Children Now's Director of Early Learning, Gina Perez, is here and will be part of the Q&A process. But now I want to turn it over to our Education Director, Samantha Tran, who's been played a huge role in the policy efforts behind local control funding formula and now implementation. So Sam, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ted. So as Ted mentioned, there are a variety of folks on the phone, and so what we thought we'd do, we're hoping to achieve some takeaways by the end of the webinar. First, we're going to provide a quick overview of LCFF. Many of you have been on our webinars before or are deeply entrenched in this work, and there is some growing understanding across the state. But given the newness of this approach, we definitely want to review LCFF, some of the high points, before we dive into the ELD specific aspects. Then we're going to take on 3 interrelated concepts and apply them directly to LCFF and ELD. We've been doing a lot of work running up and down the state, talking with school leaders, community-based organizations, parents groups, and everyone's trying to figure out at this moment in time, how do we set the table to have effective local conversations around plans and budgets that really focus on student outcomes. And we think there are 3 key things that, as we're starting this process, that are important to think through and be mindful of, and we'll work to specifically apply those to early learning and development and LCFF. And so a focus on, 1, building relationships. There are going to be a lot of stakeholders who are involved, and so how do you start building those partnerships? Secondly, because this is all very locally driven, context is going to be important, and so really assessing the lay of the land and understanding where the process is at is going to be important. And then third, there is this new exciting element that's related to LCFF that I think specifically creates this opportunity around ELD, and that's this idea of multi-year planning. And so as we go through each of these 3 areas, we'll be lifting up specific tips for folks to think about, some questions that might help as you're doing your local work and assessment and planning, and then some examples to highlight possibilities just for us all to begin having this conversation together. And then, as Ted mentioned, we'll end the webinar by talking a little bit about next steps, so some of the things that we're going to pursue in order to hopefully support the field, and then also ask the question to everyone who's participating, what resources and information would be useful and helpful as we collectively move forward. So a little background on LCFF. The local control funding formula was many, many decades in the making. It started as California moved to a system of providing, being much more state funded at the state level, which over time led to a lot of irrationalities in the system, and it made it very difficult at the local level to plan and budget because of some of the convoluted nature of the finance system. And so there was a lot of research and policy development and legislative attempts over the last decade in particular to think through how we would transition from the old system to something that was more student-focused, that was more rational, and that changed the nature and relationship between the state and local communities. And so what all that work led to was a very diverse coalition of equity partners, school district leaders, parent groups, business leaders, civic groups, up and down the state, working in concert with the governor to develop the formula, to develop the structure, and ultimately get it passed this year. And so it became a reality in June of this year, and now we're in the process of really implementing it and working both at the state level and the local level to get this new approach up and running. So what does it mean for schools? It was a historic investment in equity in high-need kids. California is prioritizing, once LCFF is fully implemented, nearly $10 billion in low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. That wouldn't have happened otherwise outside of LCFF if you just look at the past trajectory around how we funded schools. So it is a major investment and prioritization in high-need students. In addition, it clarified and made much more simple how schools are funded by the state so that stakeholders could really understand the system, which we're hoping will help build transparency and trust by the larger public in what schools are doing at the local level. In addition, it provides greater control over how local communities invest those resources, which again is a new dynamic. As Ted mentioned earlier, it is not necessarily a significant new investment in public education. As we all know, we've just come off of the Great Recession, and there were deep cuts in K-12 and in early learning and development. And even before that, California was one of the lowest funded states in the nation. So LCFF does many great things, and it creates an opportunity for further investment, but it doesn't necessarily address the overall resource issue. So as I mentioned, we're going to be transitioning to LCFF over a number of years. This first year, we got about 12% of the way between where we were in 2012-13 to full implementation of LCFF. And so it's estimated that it may take anywhere between 7 to 9 years to get to full implementation, because it's linked to the state budget and overall resources for public education. So it will take time to get from here to there. So how does the formula work? The LCFF simplifies how we fund schools, and it makes it more rational and easier to understand, but it does have lots of nuances in it. And so we've tried to demonstrate how the formula works using pictures so that you can see there is an overall amount of funding that by the time we fully implement, every child in the state will have access to what we call base dollars. Those base dollars are adjusted based on grade span. So there's a little bit more money for K-3 and a little bit more money for higher education, for high school, because we know that there's some differential impacts. So for example, the lower grades, if we want to do lower class sizes, at the higher grades, labs and sports and all those other things, career technical education programs that often cost more. And then, this issue of equity, of really investing in low-income English learners and foster youth. So there's additional funding provided for those students. And in recognition of the research that shows that where you have high concentrations of poverty and need, there's often a heightened level of service that's required. And so there's what we call a concentration factor that provides more funding for districts that have 55% or more high-need students, and that increases with each child above that threshold. Now, this formula represents how the funding is being generated by school districts, but it doesn't dictate how districts and communities can invest those dollars. And I think this is really important to lift up in the context of early learning and development, because as you can see, there's no 0 to 3 time frame on the formula, but funding can certainly be used for those purposes, especially since the research demonstrates how strongly they impact student outcomes. So another important element, and we'll be talking about this mostly as we're walking through the rest of the webinar, is around what this means in terms of local planning, budgeting, and accountability. And a kind of cornerstone element of the new formula is the inclusion of these local control and accountability plans. And the idea behind these plans was to provide greater transparency about how the resources were going to be used, to really provide an opportunity to engage all stakeholders in the process of developing an approach and making investments. And so the LCAP, which is used for short, is essentially a 3-year plan that has to be updated annually. And for the first time, these plans, so districts and schools, they're used to doing plans. We've done lots of plans at the federal level for better or less effect. And what I think is distinct and potentially powerful about this new plan is that it's linked to the district's entire budget. So it is the narrative for how districts and communities are going to be approaching student outcomes and how they're investing all of their resources to achieve those outcomes. And so it has the potential to be a dramatically new dynamic. So in the context of these plans, the state has identified 8 state priorities that are important to the legislature, the larger public, stakeholders, essentially what we value in public education and what we want to make sure is addressed. And so those 8 state priorities are laid out here. There's also an opportunity at the local level for local priorities to be developed. So for example, at a local level, if you determine that school readiness is an essential need, you can make that a local priority and invest resources to that end. So just really quickly in terms of the priority areas, there are some key context or input things that are important. So for example, high quality teachers, instructional materials, safe facilities, making sure that the academic standards are being implemented, that parents are involved in both their child's education and decision making, and then there's a lot of focus on outcomes. So how are students' achievement across multiple measures that are include both assessments and also college and career readiness? Are students engaged? Do they feel supported? Are they attending school? What's the school climate like? Is there a lot of suspensions, expulsions? Do kids feel connected? So those are all important pieces. And then there's also a focus on ensuring that there's access to other areas of the curriculum like physical education and the arts. And so these are listed up as being key priority areas that school districts, charters, county offices are all going to have to respond to as they're developing their local plans. So with that, I think we'll dive right into these kind of 3 interrelated pieces that we think are really important as local communities are coming together around developing their plans and budgets, and how early learning and development can be a key component of that process. So there are 3 tips that we want to lay out there as folks are thinking about this and building relationships and thinking about their local outreach and engagement. One is to clearly articulate why early learning and development is relevant and why it's important. 2, to learn more about the district's financial situation, because this will play into what new investments can and will be made. And so we'll talk through a little bit about strategies for getting a better handle on that piece of it. And then finally, this piece around how we connect with other partners and stakeholders, because there will be a lot of voices in this process. And again, this is new by many respects. And so how we support that engagement and develop partnerships will be critical. So first, as we've mentioned, early learning development is such a strategic support for schools in terms of achieving student outcomes, and there is an ample amount of research that really talks about the impact that it has on many of the priority areas that we were just discussing in terms of the new plans. And so, for example, student achievement, student engagement, school climate, parent involvement. So I'll walk through a little bit of that research. We won't beat that too long, because I know that the folks on this phone call know that intimately. But it's important to really characterize that research and what we know in terms of best practices and how it has a direct and relevant relationship to what schools are trying to achieve through these new LCAPs. So, for example, on student achievement, we've got sound research over many decades that talks about how quality programming makes it less likely that students are going to be placed in special education, that they're going to move through the grades at the appropriate timing, that they're more likely to graduate from high school, and that the benefits are often even stronger among low-income, dual-language learners than their counterparts. Another piece of data that we wanted to lift up was related to some of the teen programs, teen parenting programs, where there's services both for the teen parent as well as the young child, and some of the demonstrated outcomes that has, as it relates to the teen parent, them graduating at a much, much higher rate than their counterparts. I know our team in early learning and development has also, talked a lot about the Sabranto Early Academic Program pilot, or SEAL, That's a comprehensive model that has enrichment language and literacy education specifically for English learners and the impact that that has. So again, I think there's a lot of research, a lot of examples that folks can look to in terms of what are impactful for kids. There's also similarly a lot of good research that lifts up the impact on other key priority areas like student engagement and school climate. And so, we're able to demonstrate that students have improved regulatory skills when they go through high-quality programs, that parents, especially when programs are focused on really engaging and supporting parents both in their habits with kids at home and creating an environment where they can have more impact and feedback on programming, that translates into later skills as parents and kids move into the K-12 system. And so again, a direct impact on parent involvement. So, as we start building relationships locally between district leaders and various stakeholders about the value of early learning and development, that we think is an important place to start. And similarly, as we're having conversations with district leaders and partners about what's possible and how we can build programming, one of the things to note is that, again, kind of going back to our earlier conversation, we're going to be slowly transitioning to LCFF. And because LCFF was, in many respects, a response to kind of the convoluted nature in which we funded schools, and it wasn't actually based on their student demographics, every district in the state, every charter school, every county office is going to be transitioning at their own rate. So they'll be starting at a unique spot based on those historic anomalies. They'll be growing over time at their own kind of rate, and they will be ending with a target that is very much linked to their student demographics. And so, as you're having conversations with school leaders, and school leaders are having conversations with stakeholders, it's important to lay out that fiscal picture because it will, in many respects, determine the pacing of when different programming can be put into place. And so, couple of the sample questions that we've been sharing with folks as they're thinking about that fiscal assessment is to look at, for example, whether or not the district has a rainy day fund, because we're coming off of some very bad years and deep cuts into public education, and some districts made those deep cuts and then had a big reserve because they weren't sure if Prop 30 was going to pass or not. And so they may be doing okay on that front, whereas other districts have been severely deficit spending, which means that their budget was out of alignment, and so they still have some work to do to get back to right the fiscal ship. And so that's an important dynamic. In addition, and closely related, there was lots of cuts to the core program. So we saw class sizes go through the roof. We saw anything, librarians, nurses, if they had them, were being cut. And so there's a lot of that dynamic at play as we start building back. In addition, to my point earlier, districts are going to be growing at different rates because of their historic levels of funding, and so that's an important dynamic to know as you're assessing, what's possible in the short term and what we should be looking towards over time. So, in addition to talking about ELD within the context of this new framework of priority areas and a local plan, and understanding kind of where the district is at based on their fiscal dollars. And another important dynamic locally will be this issue of building relationships, because the vision here is that stakeholders, and that includes the staff and teachers and administrators and board members, in concert with parents and community-based organizations, civic leaders, business leaders, are all being involved in the process. And so if we're doing this well, we're actually going to be hearing lots of voices, all focused on what we want for kids' outcomes and how to prioritize resources over time. And so it's going to be really important to figure out who are the active stakeholders who are engaged already, because we're seeing up and down the state folks starting to really engage. And then there are voices that should be activated, that should be a part of this conversation, that may not have been to date. And so how do we bring in those partners? And especially as we're thinking about early learning and development, there are some very strong partners in that 0 to 5 space. First 5 associations, local planning councils, ELD providers, resource and referral networks, all of which have assets, and we'll get into this a little bit later about how we think about supplying information, how we build programming, how we build partnerships. So this is the time to really assess all of those different players and to figure out where there's areas of alignment and to develop partnerships and potentially coalitions to move the work forward. So assessing the context, as we're developing relationships and getting a better sense of the dynamic locally, we think it's really important to again take districts and charters and county offices on a unique one-by-one basis and really have some of those local conversations. And so one of the key elements of ways that people can engage is around existing processes and the processes that are going to be put into place under LCFF. So for example, there are many districts across the state that have gone through efforts to engage their stakeholders around developing a vision and a strategic plan around student outcomes. And that work is very much akin to what the LCAP is intending to encourage and support. And so for those districts that have gone through that process, now's the time where many of them are trying to figure out how do we take what we've done and translate that and connect it to this new planning process under the LCAP. What are the relationships? How do they mutually reinforce each other? It can also give, that work can also give stakeholders a sense for how educators are viewing their work and how stakeholders are engaged in that work, especially if it's a living document. If it really is something that is guiding practice at the local level, it can be really informative about where the district is at, and hopefully there are connections being made between that and this new LCAP. In addition to that that piece, districts also have to respond to timelines around budget, and these timelines are both within the context of the law, certain deadlines when things need to happen, and then there's also best practices. And so there's a lot of conversation happening up and down the state about how do we do this work well around authentic community engagement, and what's the timing for that. And resoundingly what we're hearing is that in the summer and in the fall is when you start having those big picture conversations about what you want to achieve for kids and the direction you want to move in. And then when you start moving into January and February and March, you get more granular about, okay, what resources do we have, what are we going to prioritize, and then decisions start getting made, and the budget ultimately obviously has to be adopted by the end of June. And so those timelines and historical practice is now going to be feeding into the planning timelines around the LCAP and the budget. And so a lot of this work is still being figured out. There's best practices emerging, but this is going to be an ongoing process where we're learning how to do this well. Similar to the budget timelines, there are minimum requirements in the law under LCFF around funding levels. Around processes. And in addition to that, there's a whole lot of ideas around best practices. And so this picture right here is actually from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and it is a fair representation of the minimum requirements in the law. And so as you see, these things could happen pretty quickly behind each other in terms of, you solicit written comment, you present it to your advisory committee, you have a public hearing, and then you adopt the plan. Districts can proceed in that way based on the minimum requirements in the law. But the spirit of the law really is around creating more authentic engagement, and that is going to require early, ongoing engagement of partners and really providing an opportunity for voice. And so finding out and assessing at the local level what the district or the charter school or the county office is thinking about in terms of their planning process and how they're going to continually improve that, because again, this is kind of the first year out of the gate, everyone's figuring it out, but we're going to have, on an annual basis, an ability to improve practice on this front. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think the really exciting thing about LCFF is that it puts kids at the center of planning and budgeting, and so that kids' outcomes are the primary focus, and how we're going to develop our plans, prioritize our resources, and invest those resources. And so, as you're engaging with districts, one of the things that could be a helpful tool is to really assess what are the student outcomes that are being lifted up as the kind of key focal areas for work, because there's going to be a lot of information that cuts across the 8 priority areas, and that's going to be broken down by student subgroups, so by English learners, low income, foster youth, by various ethnic subgroups. And so when we're looking at that data and assessing how kids are doing, there's going to be areas where there's red flags, where it jumps out and you're like, wow, our African American male population, is having an issue transitioning from middle school to high school, and we're concerned about achievement issues. Or we're looking at our foster youth data, which districts for the first time are going to be getting here shortly, which is really exciting. But we're looking at how well those students are achieving and whether or not they're graduating on time. And so here comes an opportunity to really think about these student outcomes. And as those outcomes are being discussed, I think there are so many linkages back to what programs and services did they have 0 to 5? Were they ready when they came in the door? Did they have that support system? And so tapping into that conversation, and also again lifting up other outcome areas that may be below people's radar. So for example, people may not even know how kids are doing when they first come into kindergarten. There may not be good data there, but there are tools or resources that could be implemented to get a better handle on that information. So in addition to looking at the planning processes and the budget timelines, and then looking at what are some of the major student outcome areas that are being discussed and becoming the focal point for conversation, I think the major value add that the early learning community can bring to bear is to also share information about the needs of the 0 to 5, of children 0 to 5 in your community. And I know that there's a lot of work that's been done by First 5 associations, local planning councils, resource and referral networks, extensive partnerships across the state to really get a handle on these issues around what supply of high-quality programs do we have in place, and what impact these programs are having on children's outcomes, and especially as we can relate that to the priority areas that districts are going to be looking at, and any local priority areas that are going to be developed. That's a core opportunity to begin bringing these two worlds of practice together. I also think there's a good opportunity to talk about the demand. We know that there's a whole lot more demand for these programs than there is supply, and that unmet need could be where we're seeing a lot of the gaps in achievement and the gaps in readiness. And so having those conversations, sharing that information as we're going through this process, and really being clear about, to the extent that it's possible, where are these gaps and with which populations of students, so that we can then look at how that translates as we move into the K-12 space. So as I said earlier, districts and communities do have a lot of assets on this front. It's not like we're starting from scratch. We have programming and practice, and there's an opportunity here to build a bridge between 0 to 5 and K-12. And so looking at what the district's assets are, what the community's assets are, creates a real opportunity to think about what's possible. And so here are just a few questions to prompt some ideas. I know that as we've been talking with a few districts up and down the states, one of the first things that they're doing is looking at where they may have previously cut programs, where they may have had some high-quality preschool or 0 to 5 childcare, on site or in partnership with other communities, but they had to cut them because we went through this major recession. And so that's a good place to start to see, what did we used to have. In addition, we do have these different federal and state funding sources that are being drawn down at the local level, and having a clearer picture about where those resources are being put into place and to what ends, and so we can get some mapping, again, of what the current supply is, what the opportunity is for expansion. In addition, and I think this is also important, is in addition to the historic programs and the existing programs, are there new programmatic ideas that make sense based on what we're learning from emerging research and practice? And so, trying to get that all into one place to get a sense of the landscape, and then to determine how the partnerships are working in the local level. Where existing strong partnerships are at play, and where new partnerships could be forged, where there's a real opportunity for people to come together. And then these last two are kind of more, one's more logistical and one's data oriented. Facilities obviously is going to be a core issue depending on where programs can be placed. So to the extent that a district is in decline, there may be opportunities to retrofit previous kindergarten classes and the like. There may be a need to build new facilities. There may be, as we said, previous programs that were cut due to the recession that are available, and so understanding what the facilities context is locally will be critical. And then in order to help make the case and for local stakeholders to really get their head around what the need is, one of the things that we're seeing across the state is communities investing in kindergarten readiness tools to really assess where kids are when they come into the system, and we know that we have a number of these tools up and down the state. The California Department of Education has also developed a tool and shared that statewide. And so there are opportunities here to think about and assess the local need. So in addition to assessing the landscape, developing partnerships, and building relationships, again, I think the critical opportunity that is available through the new local control funding formula is this chance to develop plans that are student-based, that are linked to the budget, and that they're multi-year. And I think the critical component related to multi-year is that previous practice has been often to make programmatic decisions just based on the current resources you have. And that's a fiscally sound approach because you don't necessarily know what you're going to have next year. And so building a multi-year vision for ELD, I think there is this opportunity to, again, first focus on student outcomes, and then looking at what the community assets and needs are, and then thinking about what's the vision, what's possible based on what we're trying to achieve for students, what we currently have in place, and what we could have in place, and then thinking about our approach and how we're going to prioritize resources. And so, here's some example questions that could help as locals are developing this process and coming together around the needs of kids. And so first, thinking about, what are the program approaches that most fit the local need? Is it, expanding our current preschool program? Is it thinking about teen parents in our community and wanting to provide services both for them and their young children? Does home visiting make sense in terms of helping to build this bridge between parents and schools? And once you have that vision in place, really starting to break out and think very clearly about how many children would be served, what student populations in particular would be focused on, are there quality improvement efforts that we know would ensure that the program really is achieving the outcomes that we want for kids. And based on all that, developing and costing out different models of how you would approach this and how much resources it would actually take to achieve that vision. And having that insight, end goal in sight, will then help think through kind of the next phase, where you really do then break it down by strategic investments. And so, looking at what investment could be made this year or next to start us down the path of achieving our vision. And then what would be year 2 and 3, what would that look like in terms of the dollar amounts, and making it a stair-step approach to reaching the vision. So for example, one of the things that we've been thinking about is in many districts, early learning and development hasn't really been on their radar. They've been focused obviously on K-12, and so they may come to that ultimate vision about, we really do think that early learning and development programs would be essential in our community, but we don't yet have enough information to figure out how to move forward. And so a strategic investment might be working with partners to develop and implement a kindergarten readiness assessment tool, observation tool, so that the district and stakeholders can systematically look at how ready are students when they first come in, and what are the needs, and where are their gaps, and are there patterns in the gaps? Is it in certain neighborhoods? Is it among certain subgroups? And so doing that analysis may be a viable first step in moving in this direction. Other districts may be much further along, and they have historically already invested into 0 to 5 programming, and so they may be in a place where they're looking with partners and seeing, well, we have a number of preschool slots, but they're only half day, and they're being underutilized. And they're being underutilized because a lot of those parents need full-day childcare. And so are there ways to build partnerships where we can have full-day wraparound care? And these are just a few of the examples. There are lots of approaches that local communities can use in order to find the appropriate local match. So, and we're just about to wrap up, but I want to reiterate something that Ted mentioned earlier. We know that LCFF in and of itself is not going to be sufficient to meet the important investment needs in early learning and development. Early learning and development took a major hit during the Great Recession, and K-12 did as well. The cuts were deep, and we're still recovering from them. But we also know that that communities are beginning to pull their way out of it, think about investments, and LCFF does create this really important opportunity. And I think it's twofold. One, that in the short term, that we can provide more high-quality services for for children 0 to 5, that we're actually expanding access and quality, and that school leaders in that process are also seeing the value and impact that it's having on the K-12 outcomes as well. And so that's a twofer in of itself. I think in addition to that, in terms of the long-range strategy, that as we lift up early learning and development more and more across communities across California, that the public and policymakers will also see the contribution and see why it's so essential that we make those early investments to achieve the goals that we've identified for kids. So next steps. As Ted mentioned, we are very vested in making sure that we can support communities and stakeholders and districts throughout the state as these conversations are happening. And so we're in the process right now of developing a toolkit that is just this material written out and easily accessible that we'll be updating often. We're going to be providing more of these webinars. Today was just a initial setting of the stage and some grounding as we move forward. We'll be providing regular updates, and in select communities we also have some capacity to support local convenings. So that's a lot of the work that we'll be doing moving forward, but we want to make sure that that's grounded in what folks need locally, and so would welcome and appreciate thoughts and feedback about what types of information would be useful, what types of venues would be supportive, and would again value that deeply as we move forward. So with that, I think we'll open up to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. So just a couple clarifying points, and then we've just got a couple questions. And so if you do have a question, send it in. Otherwise, we'll be able to wrap up a little bit early here. First, during the webinar, one of the participants just wanted us to note we have a lot of terminology in the birth to 5 and K-12 space, and so some folks in the K-12 world, when they hear ELD, they might be thinking English language development. And just for clarification's sake, when we're talking about the ELD, we're talking about early learning and development, really the birth to 5 space, and that it's early learning and needed developmental support as well. So just a clarification there that there's two ELDs being bounced back and forth. Secondly, someone sent in a question, will the slides be available after the webinar? Yes, we will be emailing this out to all the participants, and will also be available on our site to share. Then the two questions we had, someone just asked for just a little bit more clarification about the comments made about short-term and long-term, and the piece that Sam just went through, really emphasizing that every district's finances are different, and some districts are already investing in early learning programs. Other districts that aren't might be in a dynamic given their student population of getting some significant additional dollars to LCFF. So there is an opportunity around the state for a number of districts to be able to use those dollars targeted for low-income kids and English learners for early learning programs. And so that's a very short-term focus that it's important for ELD advocates to push to districts, and as districts are preparing their budget and finalizing them next June. The long-term point that Sam went through that we just want to emphasize is that even a district that is not getting any additional resources through LCFF, is not currently funding early learning programs, every district through their local planning process can highlight the need for early learning to meet the academic achievement goals that all districts need to meet. The next question is, where does the DRDP-SR fit into the collection of data and continuity of individual student progress? I'm actually going to ask Jeannie Perez to answer that question.
Hi, everyone. Well, I first need to thank Sam for doing such an amazing job. I myself learned a lot about this, and I'm really excited about what we can do to bridge early learning and development with K-12. Thank you so much to the questionnaire asking about, or the question about DRDP-SR. Absolutely, what we would really love to see is really have desired results developmental profile school readiness tool, which for those of you who don't know is something that the Department of Education has created. It is a free tool that really can help engage teachers and support them so that they can individualize class instruction at the transitional kindergarten, the TK, as well as the K level. And we really see that as something that we want to promote. And as Sam mentioned as one of the examples, if a school district would like to augment with specific professional development and training around the tool, we've heard from some counties that's a really valuable way for them to get more of their teachers trained on DRDP-SR, that they can have an actual person come in and train them, and that would augment the online training that right now is available through WebSed.
Great, thank you very much, Janina. The next question is, will you or anyone be able to assist in preparing parents to be involved in this extent, and would you be able to offer these type of informational sessions for parents and in multiple languages? The answer is yes, and hopefully yes. Just to back up, the parental engagement piece in LCFF is absolutely critical. I mean, every district is required to really ensure there's true parental engagement in terms of the local planning. But we also want to emphasize that we think the early learning world is a great opportunity for districts to meet that part of that parent engagement component, because the parent engagement is key throughout the education spectrum, but particularly so in those early years. So in terms of this specific question, yes, as Sam noted, in terms of next steps and coming resources, we are going to be putting together some toolkits and some continual updates to the field. Some of those will be a little bit detailed or on the wonky side, that similar to some of the slides that we've been using today, but some will be directly aimed at parents and caregivers, and much easier talking points that folks can use when talking to a school board member or school leader or community group. And we are seeking support to make sure that we can send them out in multiple languages and have them translated, and or also hoping that folks can take the information we send out to communities throughout the state and are able to get them translated if we're not able to do that in all the languages that are needed. The next, Sam, I think if you want to take this one, how does or could LCFF impact adult school parent education programs?
That's a good question. So adult school is another area where local communities can invest in, and we know that there are a lot of good models that look at parents in that context and develop some programming that focuses on the early years as well. And so I believe some good research on that front. In the short term, and this probably is a little wonky, but I'll put it out there because I think it's important to note. In the short term, districts that previously had adult ed programs need to maintain those for this year and next year, and they'll be thinking through how to transition. Whether or not, not necessarily using the state previous categorical fund to do that. Whether they're going to maintain the program through LCFF. Or develop partnerships, or discontinue the program. But it certainly is an allowable place to invest resources, and those kind of twofers where you're both educating the parent and children at a very early age are worthwhile investments.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. So we did start right on time. I hope all of you were on right when we started at 11. And so as a result, we are able to end here a few minutes early. But just as those of you who weren't on right at the beginning, just to emphasize, this webinar was really kicking off an effort that will not just be 1 year. The LCFF implementation is an ongoing process. So we will be in touch with all of you and hope you do spread the word about the information in this webinar. But we will be following up with you with more communications and toolkits and talking points as we go forward. So really just kick off that effort. As I noted at the beginning, Los Angeles County, thanks to First Five and a range of advocates there, is already rolling on this effort, but we really want to see that kind of activity throughout the state. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join with us this morning and look forward to staying in close touch with all of you. Thank you very much.